Hello everyone, welcome back. It's been so long since the last video. I'm so sorry to everyone who's been waiting and so grateful for all the love and support. I do hope you all enjoyed the last video, which was chapters 25 to 30. Oh wait, 26 to 30. If you haven't already seen all the previous videos, I'll leave the links in the description below. This will be the next 5 chapters. Before we get started, I would greatly appreciate and love if you all could like and subscribe to my channel. Also, please leave a comment down below. I would love to hear from you guys. Without further ado, let's get started. 31. Rune. The sea was freezing this time of year. Rune had opened her mouth to tell him so when Gideon shucked off his shirt. The words died on her lips. She pulled in a sharp breath, her blood running a little hotter at the sight of his muscled shoulders and arms. She coiled her fingers into her palms, pressing the nails into the skin, trying to stop herself from tracing him with her eyes, the rigid lines of his collarbones, abdomen, hips. His skin turning honey gold in the setting sun. Rune tried to look away, but something on the right side of his chest dragged her eyes back, the symbol of a thorny rose encircled by a crescent moon. Rune knew it on sight. The sister queens had their casting signatures turned into crests, and these crests were sewn into their garments. The queens wore them embroidered on the cuffs of their shirt sleeves, impressed into their jewelry, or emblazoned across their riding cloaks. The rose and crescent belonged to Cressida. A tattoo? The sound of Gideon's pants dropping into the sand made the thought freeze in her head. She stared hard at that crest, knowing he stood almost naked before her, afraid to look anywhere else. The story he told still hummed through every fibre of her being. Rage and grief and shame. His voice had been full of it, and though Rune desperately wanted to believe there was another side to the story, that Gideon was twisting the truth, she couldn't ignore that crest. It's not a tattoo, she realized, studying the red lines. It's a brand. The youngest witch queen had branded Gideon the way a farmer burns his name into an animal so that when he lets the beast out to pasture, everyone knows it's his and no one takes it home with them. Cressida had permanently marked Gideon as her property. The horror of it made Rune go cold. Gideon. Not seeing the realization dawning on her, he looped one finger into the seam of his underwear. Last chance, Rune. He dropped them next. Oh, my stars! Rune covered her eyes with her hands. Gideon sharp. Is that a blush coming up on your cheeks? The heat of his teasing chased out the cold. Why so bashful? Don't tell me you've never taken advantage of all those suitors lining up at your door. Her skin burned hotter even as the smile crept across her lips. You're the worst. Surprising them both, she laughed. Rune wanted to drop her hands and look at him, desperately, but she didn't want to take advantage the way another girl had, so she stayed where she was, keeping her eyes covered. His footsteps hissed in the sand. Instead of heading for the sea, though, they moved toward her. Rune took a step back and nearly tripped over a log. Gideon's hand grabbed her elbow, steadying her. His breath hushed against her cheek. Come with me. He stood inches away, all 6 gorgeous feet of him. She pressed her hands harder against her face. Don't you want to feel the sea on your skin? Absolutely not, she said from behind her hands. The water is freezing. Suit yourself, he said, letting her go. The water splashed as he walked into the sea. At the sound, Rune gave into the temptation, lowered her hands, and watched him wade naked into the waves. She tried to remember the part she was playing, but the protective mask she wore was slipping fast. Rune couldn't pretend to be a shallow, gossipy girl after he bared his soul to her. She couldn't tell herself there were 2 sides to the story, or that Cressida and her sisters were the actual victims. None of what had happened to him excused what he was doing now, of course. Hunting witches down one by one, propping up a violent regime. But it helped her understand him. Come on, Rune, the water's warm. Gideon had increased the stakes of their game tonight by telling her something deeply, painfully true. For Rune to match him, she needed to offer something equally so. But she'd been living a lie for so long, she didn't know if there was anything true still in her. If I didn't have to hide myself, she thought, who would I be? Who was the real Rune Winters? Not the socialite, not the Crimson Moth, but the person deep down inside her. Rune had been playing a part for so long she couldn't remember. Once, she'd been a girl who liked to wear ribbons and silks, lace and pearls. Someone who enjoyed dancing with cute boys and gossiping with fashionable friends. A girl who took tea with Nan on the terrace and went to the opera. But what made that girl Rune? She thought of the portrait hanging in her bedroom, of a wild child in a white dress trying desperately to hold in her laugh. If that girl were all grown up, what would she be like? What would she do? She would accept a challenge to swim naked in a frigid sea, thought Rune. That she knew. Slowly, she let her shawl drop. Reaching behind her, she tugged at the laces of her dress until they loosened, then pulled the cotton fabric over her skin and dropped it in the sand. The warm breeze kissed her bare stomach and legs. She took off her bralette next, then her underwear, knowing all the while that he watched from the waves. Standing naked between the dying sun, her hair whispered across her bare shoulders. Feeling mushy compared to Gideon's lean, muscled form, she fought the urge to cross her arms over herself as she walked down the sand toward the surf. She wanted him to look, to search her body for scars so he could find none. Rune had plenty of ordinary scars, everyday cuts and scrapes collected over the years, but none were the silvery kind he'd be looking for. As she stepped into the sea, the water sent a shocking jolt of cold through her. You're such a liar. She hugged herself to fend off the chill. I think a glacier melted in here. Gideon laughed, splashing water in her direction. She flinched as icy droplets scattered across her body, but she continued to wade in, taking sharp breaths as the cold crept to her knees, her thighs, her waist. What is he thinking? She wondered, hugging her chest tighter. Is he comparing me to other girls he'd seen undressed? She wished she could wipe the questions from her mind, because who cared what he was thinking? Not her. When she finally reached him, the sea was as high as her throat, and her feet arched to keep her toes on the bottom of the sandy bed. My grandmother used to bring me as a child, she said, glancing at the silhouetted island in the distance and the causeway connecting it to the shore. She would stand on the sand and shout at me not to swim too far. She was always afraid the current would sweep me away. Now would be the perfect moment to bare her soul, to tell him what being raised by a witch was like. After the secrets he'd entrusted with her, though, Rune didn't have the stomach to lie, or fake a hatred she didn't feel. But neither could she tell him the truth. Like a true predator, Gideon sensed her weakness. Turning her in must have been very hard. Not at all, she would have announced if they were in the opera box or a ballroom or surrounded by her friends. But they weren't. They were alone and playing a new game, one that was far more dangerous for Rune than for him. Turning Nan in wasn't hard, she thought. It was unbearable. Nan was my best friend. Rune glanced away from him. She was the person I most aspired to be like. The day the Republic killed her, a part of Rune died too. She remembered donning her finest dress that morning, remembered brushing her hair until it shone like midsummer wheat. Nan had taught her to always look her best, no matter the occasion, and Rune had a feeling she didn't make exceptions for public executions, not even her own. After pushing to the front of the angry crowd, Rune had nearly buckled at the sight of Kestrel atop a purging platform. Her hair, normally coiffed and held in place by a jeweled pin, fell in untidy strands around her face. They'd bruised her regal cheek and snuffed the bright gleam from her eyes. Someone had even ripped the sleeves off her shirt so everyone could see her casting scars. Kestrel's gaze was hawkish as she looked out over the sea of faces, as if she didn't notice the way they spit at her, didn't hear the vicious names they called her. The moment her eyes found her granddaughter, the attention of the crowd followed. "Did you know?" Rune could hear them murmuring. She informed the old hag. Brave little thing. She'd schooled her features into exactly the girl they wanted to see. A young heiress so loyal to the Republic, she handed her beloved grandmother over to be executed. It was a role she needed to play now. Rune knew this was just the beginning. But beneath the mask, her grief had cracked her heart in half. As their gazes locked, Nan's parched lips moved, whispering 3 small words. Words Rune didn't deserve. "I love you." The shriek of metal scraping metal had filled the air as the chains raised her grandmother skyward by the ankles. There she dangled, upside down, with her hands enclosed in witch restraints, hair swinging. One of the blood guards stepped forward with a knife and sliced her grandmother's throat. The blood splattered and gushed. Nan choked, gasping for a breath she couldn't take, her body writhing like a worm on a hook. All trace of poise and elegance vanished as she struggled against her fate. Rune dug her teeth into her lower lip, forcing herself not to scream, not to weep, telling herself to be stoic and still as the blood dripped like ribbons, big and red, and Nan finally fell still. Afterward, Rune watched them throw her corpse into a mass grave on the edge of the city. She couldn't take Nan home and bury her beneath the apple tree in the garden, where the blossoms would fall on her in the spring. She couldn't afford to show that kind of tenderness in case someone suspected the truth rooted in her heart. She told only the first part to Gideon, the part about watching Nan die. He studied her as the sun slipped past the horizon, turning the sky dark purple and washing him in tones of blue and gold. As the waves lapped around them, a kittiwake called in the distance. "You told him too much," she thought, looking sharply away, afraid he'd see the tears in her eyes. "Now he has even more reason to suspect you." Her throat swelled and her eyes burned. She stripped off her mask, and without it, she was fumbling. Suddenly, Gideon was moving through the water toward her. Before she could kick back through the waves and swim away, he reached her. Cradling her jaw in one hand, he tucked a strand of her wet hair behind her ear with the other. "It's not a crime to have loved a witch, Rune." He bent toward her until their foreheads touched and his breath tangled with hers. "If it were, you wouldn't be the only guilty one." His gentleness snuck past her defenses, unlocking the deadbolts inside her, letting the enemy in. She looked up as the tears fell down her cheeks. The sea hid their bodies, but it was clear on Gideon's face that he hadn't for a second forgotten what was under the waves. He seemed reluctant to close the distance between them, though, unsure if she would welcome it. Rune tried to tell herself she wouldn't welcome it. Gideon had probably been in the crowd that day, cheering on Kestrel's death. She absolutely shouldn't want him any closer. He was a witch hunter. He suspected her. He was closing in on her even now. And yet, she remembered him on top of her, down in the mine, how solid and heavy he was. She remembered him later, dragging her out of the water, the strength in his arms, the heat of him pouring into her. What would it feel like to have his body flush against hers? It was perverse, the way she wanted to find out. Seeing the thoughts in her eyes, Gideon trembled with restraint. His throat swallowed and his pulse beat hungrily through the hand cupping her jaw. So, this horrible wanting afflicted him too. This is a game, she told herself, nuzzling her face into his palm. It's only pretend. It's how she justified dragging her fingers through his hair and pulling his mouth down to hers. 32. Gideon. If Gideon were being honest, part of him secretly hoped it was Rune who escaped him down in that mine, which should have disturbed him. It would make her his enemy, not to mention a murderous, evil witch. But a girl who could outwit him thrilled Gideon too much to deny. Her kiss felt the same, like the first taste of something forbidden, heady and delicious, awakening all his senses at once. When her teeth grazed his bottom lip, a wicked heat surged through him, and he reached for her waist. So soft. He wanted to sink into her softness, to bury himself in her. As if she felt the same, Rune wrapped her arms around his neck and arched against him. It wasn't supposed to feel like this. Nothing was supposed to feel this good, this right. As if there was nothing to be ashamed of, as if, just maybe, he could be worthy of a girl like her. A voice that sounded like Alex hissed from deep inside him. People like Rune don't end up with people like you. It was like a bucket of ice water dumped on his head. Sucking in a sharp breath, Gideon wrenched himself away from her, stumbling back. What am I doing? Alex was right, of course. More importantly, Alex was in love with Rune. In Gideon's hasty retreat, Rune lost her balance, went under the waves, and came up spluttering. His body buzzed at the lack of her, as if Rune in his arms was the only true thing in the world, and until she was there again, everything was wrong. He shook his head, trying to shake off that feeling. Gideon, I'm so sorry. I thought... Her wet hair stuck to her cheeks, her throat, her shoulders. She swallowed hard, wide-eyed and trembling. I thought you wanted to. What? She shook her head fiercely. I'm such an idiot. Kicking away from him, she swam for shore, her strokes punching through the waves, propelling her away from him, but not before he recognized the humiliation in her voice. I thought you'd wanted to. She'd completely misunderstood. Rune. Either she didn't hear him or she was ignoring him, because she only swam faster. Gideon started after her. He needed her to know that he'd very much wanted to, still wanted to. He watched her reach the shore and stumble out of the water as the tide pulled at her legs. Rune's naked form gleamed in the lantern's light, which glowed in the sand. Even in his rush to stop her, he couldn't help but admire her. Maybe she isn't a witch. He couldn't see a single casting scar marring her smooth skin. And damn, did he look. It made him hesitate. He forced himself to remember Alex, the brother he'd betrayed by kissing Rune tonight. How could he go after the girl Alex loved and kiss her again? But if she was a witch and Gideon didn't go after her, if he didn't make it clear that he definitely wanted to kiss her, Rune would end this charade of courtship and he would lose his best chance to catch the Crimson Moth. Gideon needed to catch the moth, for all their sakes. If Rune was the moth and Alex was in love with her, he had to do it for Alex most of all. He needed to protect his little brother from yet another dangerous witch. Rune pulled on her white dress as Gideon reached the beach. Leaving her undergarments, she grabbed the lantern and fled into the woods. Gideon dragged himself from the sea, shook the water from his hair, and quickly pulled on his trousers. Seizing his shirt, he sprinted after Rune, following the glow of the lantern before he lost her completely. Chapter 33. Rune. Rune shivered in the breeze as she half walked, half ran back up the path through the woods, trying to put distance between herself and that beach as quickly as possible. The sun was long gone and the trees were dark silhouettes around her. Her dress clung to her damp legs and her sopping wet hair dripped down her back. But despite the chill, she was burning up. Stupid, stupid, stupid. Witches are cruel by nature. If Gideon believed that, and he suspected Rune of being a witch, he would think her no different from Cressida. Of course he pulled away when she kissed him. The girl she pretended to be, the shallow, gossipy socialite, annoyed Gideon. And the girl she really was, he wanted that girl dead. Rune repulsed him. How did I misread him? She wished she knew a spell to disappear for a straight week. Rune. Her heart skipped. Gideon's voice was too close. She glanced over her shoulder, but the darkness cloaked everything beyond the glow of her lantern. Turning toward the house, she quickened her pace. Not quick enough. Stop running from me. This time, his voice was right behind her. Rune was about to bolt when he grabbed her wrist, forcing her to stop. You did nothing wrong. She shook her head, a fiery shame flaring through her. I shouldn't have presumed. He stepped in front of her, cutting her off from the path leading to Wintersea House. She couldn't help but notice that, in his haste to chase her down, he hadn't put on his shirt. You presumed correctly. Then why pull away? He's lying to you. You caught him off guard with that kiss, and it cracked his facade. He doesn't want to kiss you. He never did. He just knows how to play this game better than you. Rune was about to dart around him when a sudden sound echoed through the woods. Voices. Gideon turned sharply toward it. Rune, still breathless, spotted the owners of the voices first. The flames of half a dozen torches bobbed like fireflies in the distance, coming down the path. Someone's coming, said Gideon. Obviously, said Rune, turning out her lamp. She grabbed Gideon's hand and pulled him off the path. At the sight of the marks carved into their foreheads, he frowned. Penitence? They're trespassing on your property. They're not trespassing. She kept her voice down, stepping slightly through the underbrush, taking him farther away from the path, where the thickening trees shielded them from view. I allow them to use the footpaths. Gideon was invisible beside her, his hand still in hers as the torches flickered past them. You allow them? She was glad he couldn't see the truth on her face. I do more than that. Sometimes, if she knew no one would catch her, Rune left fresh bread and cheese out for them to take. They used the paths to get to the beach, where they fish after sundown. Technically, allowing penitents to use the paths on their property wasn't giving them direct aid, and therefore wasn't illegal. Are you going to report me? No, it's just surprising. There are children among them, as he pointed out earlier. I didn't choose to be born into my position, just as those children didn't choose to be born into theirs. I'm not accusing you, Rune. I think it's admirable. His warm hand squeezed hers. Oh. A strange silence descended. Rune had loathed this boy since the day Alex first introduced them, and here she was holding his hand in the dark. By choice. The thought made her tug her fingers free, because he'd loathed her too. Still did. Wasn't that why he pushed away from her kiss? She wanted to understand it. What exactly had he seen in her then that made him reject her so adamantly? Do you remember the day we first met? Rune had been 13. She and Alex had been friends for almost 2 years when, one hot summer day, he invited her to go cliff jumping in Nameless Cove. The cove, he told her, had the best cliffs for plunging into the sea. Rune had never done anything so daring, and the thought of it thrilled her. But it was on the wrong side of town. Nan had adamantly forbade Rune from visiting Alex's home, which was in an economically disadvantaged part of the city. But she'd said nothing about Nameless Cove, so Rune didn't ask permission or even tell Nan she was going. When they arrived, she found a group of kids climbing the rocks and throwing themselves into the sea. One boy consistently climbed higher than the others and threw himself furthest. The boy was Gideon, the brother Alex had told her so much about. "How could I possibly forget?" Gideon murmured, pulling her out of the memory. The leafy canopy overhead was thinning, and with the moon shining through, Rune could see the frown marrowing his brow. Rich girl takes a tour of the outer wards to see how the dirty peasants live, and decides it's not for her. What? Her cheeks burned beneath the accusation. She didn't notice when the forest disappeared behind them. "Isn't that why you asked Alex to bring you?" "Alex invited me," she said, defensive. "Of course," his jaw clenched, "to show you off like a piece of treasure." Rune looked sharply toward his silhouette. "What are you talking about?" "Nothing. Never mind." She shook her head as the long meadow grass swished around them, tilting in the wind and brushing her bare legs. "You were so rude that day. I thought you were the rudest boy I'd ever met." "Me?" he coughed. "I was rude. You got it backward." "You insulted my clothes." "I did not." "You did. You called my dress foppish." "Oh, that. Yes, I remember." He rubbed a hand stiffly over his jaw. The lace alone would have put 3 meals on the table of every kid swimming that day. Rune opened her mouth, only to realize she didn't know what to say. "I didn't know." "You didn't know that wearing a designer dress to the outer ward was announcing just how much out of reach you were to the rest of us?" "Out of reach?" "I was 13, she said. I'd never been past the city centre. Alex was the only person I knew from the outer wards." They reached the wooden gate leading into the Wintersea Gardens. "I was so excited to meet you," she murmured. He glanced sharply at her. "But you wouldn't even shake my hand." As she opened the latch and stepped through, Gideon fell behind. I had never done it before. She turned back. "What do you mean?" "Only aristos shake hands when they greet each other. I didn't know what you were doing. It felt like you were condescending to me, or trying to keep your distance." Rune's mouth opened and shut like a fish. "You didn't know," he said, as if plucking the words from her lips. "I see that now." "You could have given me the benefit of the doubt." He sighed roughly. "Sure." "Sure? What is it you want from me? An apology?" He threw out his arms beneath the glittering night sky. "I'm sorry I was rude to you, Rune Winters. Even at 15, I was an intolerable ass." Lowering his arms, he studied her. "Will that suffice?" "That's not... I didn't... Then why is it so important?" "I don't know." She balled her hands into fists. "I guess it hurt. I wanted you to like me." Rune suddenly felt more naked now than she had on the beach. Gideon felt quiet, considering her. Wishing she could put the words back in her mouth, knowing she was giving him too much ground, Rune quickly turned and made her way into the gardens. She heard the gate swing open and shut behind her. It took him no time at all to catch up, matching her pace. He stayed quiet for a long time as they walked between the hedges. I remember the sound of your laugh, he said as the back door of the house came into view. It pulled me like a magnet toward the beach, where I found the most beautiful girl in the world standing on the shore. Vroon's footsteps slowed as they approached the door. His stopped altogether. When I saw Alex at your side, I knew exactly who you were. Vroon Winters. The girl Alex never shut up about. A girl who was entirely off limits because my little brother found her first. Vroon frowned, irked by these words. That's not the way friendship works, she said, turning back to him. Alex didn't find me. He doesn't own me. Gillen's gaze dropped to her mouth. I'm not talking about friendship, Vroon. A shiver rushed across her skin. Lifting his thumb to her bottom lip, he dragged it slowly across. His touch was like a switch, turning on an electric current that flickered through her. What about you? He asked. His eyes were bottomless pools. If she stared long enough, she might fall into them and never climb out. What about me? You thought me the rudest boy you'd ever met. His voice was low, rough. Is that all you thought? Vroon swallowed. No, it was not all. She remembered watching Gideon jump from the cliffs that day, the way his body arced through the air like a shimmering fish. No crowing bravado, only the quiet self-assurance that came with competence. You were impressive. Impressive, he murmured, the corner of his mouth approaching a smile. Anything else? Vroon bit down on her lip, not wanting to admit the rest. She remembered that same boy encouraging the younger kids who weren't brave enough to jump alone, climbing down from his heights to jump with them. Everyone admired you, she confessed. It was impossible not to, but you weren't cocky about it, even though you could have been. He drew back, as if her answer surprised him. Is this still a game, she wondered, or is this real? That she couldn't tell unsettled her. In the silence, Vroon became intensely aware of him. The shadow of stubble on his jaw, the smell of the sea on his skin. He pulled his shirt on as they walked, and she stared at the buttons now. Do you still think I'm foppish? She whispered. Of all the questions she could have asked him, why had that one come out of her mouth? His mouth quirked. Yes. He reached for her ribs, cupping them with strong hands. Do you still think I'm a brute? Definitely. His mouth brushed the corner of her jaw, sending a rush of sensation across her skin and making her breath hitch. It wasn't a kiss exactly, more of a caress. He moved lower, pressing his lips to a more sensitive place on her neck. Vroon's pulse skipped. She closed her eyes. Gideon moved lower still, to the base of her throat, kissing now, tasting her. When his teeth grazed her collarbone, Vroon inhaled sharply, fisting her hands. The soft insistence of his mouth was a dangerous undercurrent, threatening to drag her downward. His kisses continued, increasing in urgency, trailing over her skin. Was this real, or were they still pretending? She pushed her hands into his hair, cradling his head, silently telling him not to stop. Should she invite him in? Invite him up? If she could get away for a few minutes, she could cast Truth Teller, and this time she would draw the spell mark on something useful. Vroon tried to keep her wits intact as his hands slid into her hair. As he pressed her against the door, she felt magnetized, unable to resist the pull of him. Focus, she told herself. There was one rule she didn't break in the games she played with her suitors. She might invite them back to her bedroom to coax out information, but she never brought them into her bed. It was a line she didn't cross. Would that line hold with Gideon? As he kissed along her jaw, the words tumbled out of her. Do you want to come inside? Vroon glanced up, her body humming. His eyes were ink-dark and ravenous. This was happening. She was going to open the door, and they were... Gideon stepped back. Cold air rushed into the space between them. Perhaps another night, he said. Wait, what? Rune straightened, trying to recover from her shock. It's getting late. I should go home. Right, of course. The sting of rejection made Rune glance away. I'll have one of the servants fetch your horse. He shook his head. There's no need. I know where your stable is. I can fetch my own horse. She was about to insist. She would be a poor hostess otherwise, when he interrupted, catching her hand. Rune. His thumb brushed across her knuckles. I would like to come in, but I promise to go slow with you. Lifting her hand, he kissed the sensitive part of her wrist, making her shiver. And if I step through that door tonight, I'm afraid I won't keep my word. A wild feeling swept through Rune. She didn't want him to keep his word. She wanted him to take her upstairs, this instant. Good night, Miss Winters. Turning away, he headed for the stables. Rune watched him disappear around the side of the house. Shakily, with her back to the wall, she sank to the terrace stones. She could still taste him on her lips, still feel the ghost of his hands on her ribs. He doesn't actually want you. Her skin tingled everywhere he touched. You're falling for his tricks. Gideon was winning at this game, because what they'd done tonight, Rune wanted to do again, for reasons that had nothing to do with rescuing witches. I loathe him, she told the shadows in the garden, trying to remember all the reasons this was true. But her voice trembled as she said it. 34. Gideon. Gideon stood before the floor-to-ceiling window of his office, listening to Harrow relay her most recent findings. The ship we found that casting mark on? Said Harrow. An hour before it set sail, there was last-minute cargo brought on board, 2 barrels of wine delivered by an aristo. Beyond the window, the scarlet sun set over the Capitol. Formerly the Royal Library, this antiquated building, now the Ministry of Public Safety, perched on a hill in the center of the Capitol, giving a new view to the harbor. Gideon wasn't admiring the view. He was using his reflection in the glass to adjust his new suit jacket while he listened to Harrow's report. Unfortunately, the man's hood concealed his face, Harrow continued, and there was no moon that night, so the dock hands couldn't identify him. How do they know he was an aristo? Asked Gideon, doing up his cufflinks. The jacket was a gift from Rune, and had arrived less than an hour ago. To replace the one I ruined, said her accompanying note. He turned the note over, looking for the rest, but there was nothing more. It had been 3 days since he'd left Rune in that garden. Leaving her there had been more difficult than he'd cared to admit. The dockhand said he had a sophisticated way of speaking, like someone with an education. He also wore a ring on his smallest finger. Is that all? It narrows down nothing. Gideon sighed. Half the aristocracy bejewel their hands with rings. This one was plain and thin. Silver, maybe. They described it as a poor man's wedding ring. Gideon shook his head. Perhaps he was a poor man. A man can be both poor and intelligent. I'm simply relaying information, said Harrow. No need to get touchy. Both boys suspected he didn't share their station, despite his attempts to obscure it. He might have been nothing more than a merchant, late with his cargo. Gideon wondered if Rune, or whoever she employed to oversee her shipping business, kept lists of inventories aboard each ship, and if such a list might still exist weeks after the ship delivered its cargo. I'll keep my eyes open for any aristo wearing a plain silver band, he said finally, returning his reflection and eyeing the suit jacket. He'd never worn anything so fine. It was double-breasted, ochre in color, and made of satin. It fit him surprisingly well, and judging from the shop name on the box, Rune had spent a small fortune on it. When Gideon first opened the box, he could almost smell her, a delicate scent, like the wind bringing him the essence of the sea, beautiful and wild and dangerous. He frowned, shaking off the thought. She clearly meant for him to wear the coat to the Luminaries' dinner tonight. In fact, if he didn't leave soon, he was going to be late. Turning away from the window, Gideon started for the door. There's something else, said Harrow. Gideon halted, meeting her gaze. What is it? Rumors, she said, unverified. No mocking smile tugged at her mouth, and no mischief gleamed in her eyes. He nodded for her to go on. Some of my contacts say there have been casting marks seen around town, in alleyways and attics, often several signatures together, as if witches are gathering in small groups. Like an alarm ringing through his body, all of Gideon's senses heightened at once. Were any of these incidents reported to the guard? Harrow shook her head. People fear becoming suspects themselves. If soldiers find a witch's signature in someone's attic, they might be accused of sympathizing. Others secretly welcome the witch's return, like those who suffered for their loyalty to the dead queens, or those who were promised better lives under the Red Peace, only to find their conditions have worsened. Gideon remembered the moth flickering over the door of the mine the other night in Seldom Harbour. Do any of these signatures belong to her? No one has reported a Crimson Moth, but that doesn't mean she isn't among them, or leading them. Harrow lowered her voice. Gideon, penitents are saying the witches are rising, coming to take back what's theirs. They think something big is about to happen, something formidable enough to bring down the entire regime. The thought of it turned Gideon's stomach. Witches could not return to power. He devoted his life to ensuring it. The good commander needs to be told. If what Harry said was true, that more people were secretly sympathizing with witches, letting them gather in their houses and factories, they might have to bring back the raids, like in the days following the New Dawn. Speaking of the moth, said Harrow, what happened to your trap? I expected Rune Winters to be imprisoned by now. Gideon fisted his hand, remembering how close he'd come down in the mine. My plan failed. I think we've gone down a false trail. Did you take my advice? His thoughts raced back to Rune in the garden. It had taken all of his willpower to walk away from her. On the ride home, he'd nearly turned back twice. The thought of Alex had stopped him. Gideon blew out a frustrated breath. Did he regret kissing her? Yes, absolutely. What kind of man kisses a girl of his little brother's dreams? But he also liked it. He thought of Rune on the beach stripping off her clothes, letting him look. Heat flickered deep down inside him. Gideon ran a palm over his eyes, trying to chase the image out of his brain. I took your stupid advice, yes. You got her naked. He looked away as the blood rushed to his face. Harry whistled. You do move fast. And? He shook his head. There's nothing. No scars. But you were thorough? As thorough as I could be. So, you slept with her? What? No. The thought of it turned the flickering heat into a raging inferno. No, we went swimming the other night. Harrow raised a skeptical brow. I looked, growled Gideon. I found nothing. You said you went at night. How well could you see? Harrow. Gideon. This is a witch who's escaped detection for 2 years now. She won't keep her scars where anyone can find them. Did you look between her thighs? The thought of Rune's thighs made him grind his palms into his eyes. Stop. Because if I were a witch hiding in plain sight, that's definitely where I'd keep mine. Gideon groaned. You're killing me, Harrow. You need to sleep with her. Absolutely not. Don't tell me you haven't thought about it. Of course he'd thought about it. It had physically hurt to turn down Rune's invitation. The moment he'd got home, he'd gone straight into a cold shower so he could stop thinking about it. If they were truly courting, it's all he'd be thinking about. But they weren't courting. Not really. So he needed to not think about it. It's the only way to know for certain. No, he said again. It was too far, across the line. If you were committed, comrade, said Harrow, crossing her arms, if you truly want to catch your little moth as badly as you say you do, you'd leave no stone unturned. He ran both hands roughly over his face this time, then through his hair, tugging on it. Come on, Gideon. With a face like that, it won't be a chore. Gideon felt too many things at once. His chest knotted with frustration. His body ached with desire. Worst of all, he suspected Harrow was right. It had been dark when they went swimming. He looked at Rune from a distance, and he hadn't truly inspected every inch of her. The thought of doing so made him swallow hard. If he wanted to know without a doubt whether Rune Winters was a witch, he would have to take this to the end of the line. But could he live with himself afterward? On the one hand, his brother might never speak to him again. On the other, if Rune was the Crimson Moth, and if the Moth was not only rescuing witches, but murdering Bloodguard soldiers and planning an uprising, Gideon had the responsibility to do whatever it took to find out, to stop her. He growled low in his throat. Fine. He remembered Rune pulling off her dress, the fabric sliding up her legs, over her hips, along her torso. The thought of her dropping the dress in the sand and peeling off her undergarments. Feeling strangely breathless, he said, I'll do it. Once he knew for certain if she was innocent, he would proceed accordingly. If Rune wasn't the Moth, nor in league with her, she posed no threat to Alex, in which case Gideon would break off his courtship before things escalated further and point her toward the man who actually deserved her, his brother. And if she is the Moth? Flashes of memory shimmered like glass, Rune wading naked through the water toward him, the soft give of her waist beneath his hand, the taste of her skin like sea salt and soap. But it wasn't only her physical attributes that had him spinning. It was her kindness, her thoughtfulness, her wildness. It was her willingness to argue with him. If he wasn't careful, he might fall in love with her. Gideon started toward the door. If you have nothing else to report, I'll take my leave. He was already running late. Nothing else, said Harrow, falling into step behind him. I'll walk you out. The moment they walked out of his office and into the hallway, a soldier from his regiment strode toward them. Harrow leaned against the wall, keeping out of their way. At the sight of the young woman's blanched face, Gideon stayed where he was. Captain. The soldier halted before Gideon. The Tasker brothers still haven't reported for duty. Still? Gideon had thought it strange when he was first made aware of their absence earlier in the day. It wasn't like them. The Taskers' bloodlust for witches made them devoted soldiers. Gideon might despise their tactics, but their work ethic was top-notch. And it was evening now. Tardiness was one thing, but missing an entire shift? Gideon frowned, thinking of the mutilated bodies of Bloodguard soldiers found across the city these past few months, like a trail of bloody breadcrumbs. An ominous feeling settled over him. He glanced at his watch. Can you send Lila to check their apartment? Lila's at the prison tonight. He could send another officer, but what if the brothers weren't there? Would another soldier know where else to look? Gideon would know, but he was already late for the luminaries' dinner. If he went to look himself, he might miss the dinner entirely. Gideon ran his palm over his forehead. Fine, he said. I'll go. But I need a telegram sent immediately. Of course, sir. Walking back into his office, Gideon grabbed the fountain pen off his desk and scrawled a hasty note. Folding it, he wrote down the address and handed it over. Make sure this message gets to Wintersea within the hour.
Chapter 35. Rune. Majora, the second highest spell category. Majora spells are major spells requiring the fresh blood of someone else, either taken with permission or given freely. Examples of Majora spells include summoning a natural disaster or inflicting a deadly disease. From Rules of Magic by Queen Calidora the Valiant. I enchanted the jacket, said Rune, standing in her shift as Verity pinned up her hair.
Gideon struck it. That was bold.
The words were mumbled around the pin clenched between Verity's teeth.
Where did you put the spell mark?
In one of the interior pockets. Rune had drawn the bloody mark for Truth Teller inside the pocket a few hours ago and sent the package off. If it arrived on time and Gideon wore it, Rune would pull the answers she needed from him like loose threads from a sweater. Rune was determined to be more ruthless tonight. After 3 days of his silence, no telegrams, no flowers, no more requests for walks, Rune had to conclude he'd forgotten her. Normally after such an encounter, her suitors tried to secure her affection by sending extravagant bouquets or inviting her on intimate picnics in the countryside. Not Gideon Sharp. Clearly, he couldn't care less. There, said Verity, twisting up the last red gold strand and putting one final pin in Rune's hair. All done. Rune glanced into the mirror. In a style that looked deceptively simple, her friend had braided several thin strands and weaved them into loose waves, then pinned all of it up in an elegant bun at the back of Rune's head. Having grown up with older sisters who taught her all their tricks, Verity always did Rune's hair better than she ever could. What are you going to wear? Asked Verity, who was still in the white blouse and pleated skirt of her school uniform. She'd come straight from class to get Rune ready for the Luminaries' dinner. Verity might be displeased with Rune courting Gideon, but she was still committed to helping her. As Rune went to fetch her new dress, Lisbeth knocked at the door. A telegram for you, Miss Rune, said the housekeeper, setting it down on the dresser. Rune picked it up, her pulse quickening. She broke the seal and unfolded it. Miss Rune Winters, Wintersea House. I will be late to dinner tonight. There is a matter that needs my immediate attention. Gideon. Her shoulders fell along with her hopes. This was the first she'd heard from him in 3 days, and there was neither an apology nor a promise to make it up to her. Is there truly some urgent matter, or is he avoiding me? Who is it from? Asked Verity, peering over her shoulder. Rune shook off the sting and held the telegram out to her friend. Gideon's going to be late. Verity's eyes narrowed on the message. She glanced up. Will your spell last long enough? It should last until midnight. The magic would fade a little as the night wore on, but that wasn't what she was worried about. What if he doesn't come at all? What if he's changed his mind about me? Maybe their conversation had convinced him she was exactly as shallow as she pretended to be, or her kissing wasn't up to his standards. Or maybe, upon seeing her fully undressed, Gideon had decided he was no longer interested. Rune chewed at her thumbnail. She wasn't used to being rejected. She hated feeling like she wasn't good enough, smart enough, or pretty enough. Is this how a real courtship made you feel? Fragile and unsteady? Like the slightest breeze could knock you over? Worse than all of this, if Gideon didn't come tonight, he'd ruin her plan before she could even put it into action. She needed him to come, to be interested in her, so she could get the information required to rescue Seraphine. I'm coming with you, said Verity, wrenching Rune from her thoughts. What? No, don't ruin your evening. Rune sat on her bed. You have homework to do, and tests to study for. And you have to give that dreadful speech, all alone. The least I could do is provide moral support. Who knows? Maybe I can do some poking around while I'm there. I could pretend to get lost, and when some helpful guard escorts me back, I'll ask a few innocent questions about the prison's security. In truth, if Gideon was going to jilt her, and so publicly, Rune wanted Verity close by. Looking her friend's uniform up and down, she said, "You'll have to borrow a dress." "Obviously," said Verity, smiling as she moved towards Rune's closet full of clothes. "Take whatever you like," said Rune, except for the green one hanging on the door. It was the gown Gideon had made her. She'd sewn a hidden pocket inside it. As her friend searched for something to wear, Rune opened the false wall of her casting room and stepped inside. As she went to retrieve her blood vial, in case she needed any extra spells tonight, a book on the desk caught her eye. Rune rarely left spell books lying around, and she didn't immediately recognize this one. She stepped up to the desk, glancing down at its gilt edges and thick spine. Opening to the first page, she realized it was one of Nan's rarer spell books, full of powerful curses. That's odd. The spells in this book were too powerful for Rune to cast, so why was it on the desk? She didn't remember bringing it down from the shelves. Maybe Verity did? Her friend liked to search these books for new spells that might be useful for Rune to learn. The only other person who knew about this room was Alex and Lisbeth. Lisbeth sometimes came in uninvited to dust the shelves and sweep the floor. Symbols graced the spell book's pages, along with stylized illustrations and detailed descriptions. As she flipped through it, the book fell open near the middle, to a spell called Earth Sunderer. On the left page were 7 golden spell marks, each one more complicated than the last. Beneath them lay a description of what the curse did. The opposite page contained an illustration of a town carved in half. An earthquake had ruptured the city, breaking buildings and severing streets, while the town's inhabitants screamed in fear. Don't even think about trying that one. Rune glanced up to find Verity beside her, peering down at the page, a dress hanging over her arm. If an unlocking spell makes you faint, this spell will put you in a coma. Turning the book so she could see it better, Verity's gaze skimmed the description. You need someone else's blood, and a lot of it, to cast this one. The words reminded Rune of her conversation with Gideon in the woods, and the things he said about the sister queens. If anyone knew the truth, it would be Verity. Her sisters were friends with the Rosebloods, and they had often cast spells together. Verity, do you think the Roseblood sisters used arcana spells? Verity glanced up from the spellbook pages. Why do you ask? Gideon told me something strange the other night. A warm burn moved across Rune's cheeks as she thought of him on the beach, of his clothes hitting the sand and the sea sluicing over his chest, of his mouth on hers. She forged ahead. He accused Cressida and her sisters of killing people and using the blood to cast spells. He said they were corrupted by bad magic. And you believe him? Rune thought of the brand on Gideon's chest, the raised red skin in the shape of a rose and crescent. That scar alone seemed proof that Cressida, at least, was more than capable of extreme cruelty. I don't know what to believe. It would explain why they were so powerful. Verity's eyes grew clouded. This is how my stepfather turned my mother against my sisters. Rune drew back, startled. What? My sisters used each other's blood for their Majora spells. With permission, of course. But my stepfather walked in on them one day, in the middle of a casting. After, he declared their magic an abomination and convinced my mother the only way for my sisters to cleanse themselves and be pure again was to beat the wickedness out of them. Rune stared in horror at Verity, who'd never told her any of this. Seeing the way her friend trembled, Rune reached for her hand, lacing their fingers together. That's awful. Verity's grip tightened on Rune, her knuckles turning bone white. He would lock them up for days, beat their bare backs with belts, forced them to kneel for hours on broken glass. As if reliving the scenes, Verity dug her fingernails into Rune's skin. The worst of it was, my mother let him. She'd lost our baby sister in childbirth years before and never recovered from her grief. My stepfather used her fragile state against her, convincing her that my sisters were wicked to their cause. So when she heard their screams, she did nothing. She sided with him over her own daughters. And then she handed those daughters over to the blood guard, thought Rune. No wonder Verity hated her parents. This is why she wore herself down to keep her scholarship, so she'd never have to go home or be at their mercy. But, ouch. Rune glanced down to see her friend's fingernails about to break her skin. Verity, you're hurting me. For a moment it seemed like Verity wouldn't stop. Couldn't stop. But she shook her head and let go. Sorry. Rune pulled her hand toward her chest, studying the little half-moon marks in her skin. It's all right. You were upset. My sisters weren't corrupt, said Verity, her eyes pleading with Rune to believe her. They weren't abominations. Witches have been using each other's blood to amplify their spells for centuries. There's nothing wrong with what they did. Verity nodded to the book on Rune's desk, lying open to Earth Slenderer. That spell, for example, no witch can cast something this powerful using solely her own blood. She'd seriously hurt herself. Your sisters weren't using each other's blood against their will, though, Rune wanted to point out, which was the accusation Gideon had made against the queens. But Verity was distressed by the memory, and Rune couldn't blame her, so she let it go. Come on, said Rune, grabbing the blood vial she'd come in here to get, then eyeing the dress hanging over Verity's arm. One of last season's fashions. Let's find you something better to wear.